Hello and welcome to part 3 of our bonus challenge. So as you can see, we're tasked with recreating the fishing game. What's new in this version is we have a fully functional particle system now. So as you can see, the fish both emit water-like particles trailing behind them that kind of give the appearance of water splashing up as they swim back and forth in the scene. We did this for polishing purposes, as the original particle system was just a very dense and simplistic smoke particle design, and we thought this would better suit the game. And another thing we added for polish was, as you can see, the character can move back and forth, as well as lower and raise his fishing line, which I'll show here. Along with these features, we've added deferred rendering, which is a little hard to tell from just the default shading, but it'll become apparent in the code as we explain all of that. With that, time to get into that. So I should mention, as I have before, this base is from Michael and his tutorials, and the code has been edited by me and my partner. So if we go down here, we still have our simple variables for the object positions and moving them in the scene, as well as our player and render camera. We still use int mode to toggle between the different things, as well as the imGUI system. The toggle between our game modes here. So we've added two new ones, particle and deferred. So as you can see down here, we initialized two particle emitters. So one for a fish and one for a shark, as well as a new frame buffer object for the gbuffer. And we just initialized it down here. So we've added a couple new fragment shaders, as well as some geometry shaders and vertex shaders. So our v_pass_through, our gbuffer and full screen, as well as all of our particle geometry shaders. So duplicate, normals, and particles. And we simply create two materials for all of them and link the shaders. For initializing particles, so we take the particle emitter and we give it a life range, so how long the particles are going to last, and we give it its initial force minimum and maximum. So for the sake of our scene, I simply give it a minimum of 0 and a maximum of 5 in the Z axes, which gives it the effect of trailing straight behind the fish as it moves. And I gave it a slight alteration in the Y axes, so of 2, so they slightly bend upwards to give that kind of reflection off the surface of the water effect as they're being raised. And we're using a simple water texture, which you'll see here. So water.png, we actually got this from the internet for time purposes for this assignment, as we didn't necessarily have the time to make a fully functional high resolution particle ourselves. And right here we simply initialize 10 particles being emitted at once, so it's not too dense like the smoke was. Down here we've already talked about loading our meshes and all that in previous tutorials, as well as how our update scene works, as well as the motion.
Hello and welcome. My name is Bosco, and I'll be talking about how to implement particles into our scene, as you can see behind the two fishes. And so before we go into the main, we need to set up two things. One is a header file and a CPP file, and they're both called particle emitter SOA. And so as you can see in the header file, we need to first include these other header files in order to create this class, or this header file. And so we'll first make a class called particle emitter SOA, and then you need to set up a struct called particles, and then initialize a vector pointer called positions, vector pointer called velocities, vector pointer accelerations, a float pointer remaining lives, float pointers masses for the particles. And in public functions, we have the constructor, deconstructor, and initialize for the particle, a playback control for the particles, an update function, a draw function, a free memory function, and we need to set up a starting position in the workspace, and then we also initialize like the life range, the initial force min and then initial force max, vertex buffer object, and a boolean called playing, the material, the texture, and in the private we initialize unsigned int num particles and a boolean called allocate for the memory. And so in the CPP, obviously we need to include like the header file itself and some other header files that we needed for the implementation. So in the constructor, we initialize all the pointers to nowhere, the number of particles to 0, and the playing to false. And the constructor will, once we're finished, we'll call the free memory function to free the memory. And so in the initial function, we want to clear, so free the memory first, and then start setting up the position, velocities, acceleration, all that in here, and then we set up a VBO for the particle, and in the update function we want to allocate if the memory is allocated and it's still playing, then it will keep generating and in the draw function we set up the VBO to get the attribute descriptor vertex, and then we bind the vertex array and all that, bind the buffer, and then set the material, and then we draw finally use this function right here to draw it, and then here's how we free the memory with this free memory function. And so back to the main function, and so in the main we first need to set up the two particle emitters, and then we initialize the shader for the particles, and then we have an initialize particles function for all the particles we're gonna generate, and then we need to load the texture for the particles to actually looks like what we have in the scene. And then in display callback function we need to type something like first drawing the scene with the player camera, and then with the particle emitter we set the initial position to the fish position, and then we update it, and then draw the particles, and then we do that as well for the second fish, and then we draw it again. And so last thing we need to do call the initial particles here to generate to actually generate the particles.